First story.
The night before Christmas was cold and still. Snow fell in heavy clumps, muffling every sound in Hollow Grove. It was the kind of night where warmth felt like a distant dream, and shadows stretched a little longer than they should. Olivia sat alone in her grandmother's old rocking chair, wrapped in a thick woolen blanket. The house creaked around her as if shifting in its sleep. The only light came from the dying fire in the hearth, its embers glowing like forgotten stars. She glanced at the grandfather clock in the hallway, its brass pendulum swaying hypnotically. The clock was an heirloom passed down for generations, a gift, according to her grandmother, from a group of mysterious carolers who visited one snowy Christmas Eve long ago. Olivia's grandmother had never liked talking about that night. Whenever Olivia pressed for details, her grandmother's eyes would cloud over and she'd simply mutter, "Some gifts shouldn't be accepted." Tonight, the clock ticked toward midnight. Olivia's parents were out at a party and she was left in the old house's embrace, feeling like the walls were watching her. Then she heard it. A faint melodic hum floated through the air. The sound curled around her, delicate yet chilling. She pushed the blanket aside and shuffled to the frost-lined window. 4 figures stood at the edge of the driveway, just visible in the glow of the street lamp. They wore old-fashioned cloaks and top hats. Their faces were hidden by shadows, but the way they stood, rigid, expectant, made Olivia's skin crawl. She swallowed hard. Hollow Grove hadn't had carolers in years, not since the stories began. Olivia's fingers dug into the windowsill. Ignore them, she told herself. Maybe they'd go away. On the 3rd chime, the carolers' song cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was louder than any sound. Her stomach twisted into a knot. She peeked out the window again. They were gone. No, not gone. They had moved. Now they were standing at the foot of the porch steps, their cloaks dusted with snow. One of the carolers raised a gloved hand and knocked gently on the door. Knock, knock, knock. The knocks were soft but insistent, matching the frantic rhythm of her heartbeat. She stepped back, every nerve in her body screaming at her to hide. But as she turned to run, the door creaked open. A rush of icy wind swept through the room, extinguishing the fire with a hiss. The air turned bitter cold, like the inside of a crypt. They stepped inside. Now Olivia could see their faces, or what should have been faces. Beneath their hats were hollow voids, as though their heads had been scooped out and left empty. Their mouths stretched impossibly wide, black and cavernous. And from those voids came a whisper, a sound like dry leaves rustling in a tomb. One more voice to join the choir. The grandfather clock struck 12. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The room plunged into darkness. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. Cold hands closed around her arms, pulling her toward the figures. The world spun, her vision narrowing to a pinpoint. The last thing she saw was the pendulum of the clock, swinging back and forth, back and forth. And then the singing resumed. A chorus of voices, sweet and haunting, with new fragile voice, humming along with the carolers as they disappeared into the falling snow. When Olivia's parents returned home, they found the house almost completely silent, the fire cold. The door was ajar, snow drifting in across the floorboards. The only sound was the grandfather clock, its whispering song echoing through the empty halls. But the song sounded different somehow.
Second story. It was supposed to be the perfect Christmas. The Wainwright family, Peter, Emma, and their 2 children, Chloe and Jack, had decided to break tradition this year and spend the holidays abroad. Emma had found a brochure for an old manor house in Kilmora, a remote Irish village surrounded by misty hills and dense forests. The photos promised charm, tradition, and a Christmas unlike any other. The idea of fireplaces crackling in old stone hearths and the soft glow of candles seemed irresistible. After 2 connecting flights and a long, winding drive through rain-soaked countryside, they arrived at Kilmora Manor just as dusk settled over the landscape. The house was grand yet crumbling at the edges. the kind of place where shadows pooled in the corners of rooms, and the air carried a faint scent of damp stone. A towering Christmas tree stood in the main hall, decorated with gleaming red and gold ornaments that looked older than America itself. A soft-spoken woman named Mrs. Byrne greeted them, her thin frame almost swallowed by a black woolen shawl. Her eyes seemed to linger on the children a moment too long before she smiled. "Welcome to Kilmora Manor," she said. "I hope you enjoy your stay. We do things a little differently here." That night, after a meal of hearty stew and soda bread, the family settled into their rooms. The wind whispered through the trees outside, and an old iron bell hanging from the manor's tower clanged softly in the breeze. The next morning, Chloe, who was 10, bounded out of bed and pressed her nose to the window. A light dusting of snow covered the ground, and the village's narrow, winding streets twisted between cottages of thatched roofs. Jack, her younger brother, was still asleep, quietly snoring in his bed. After breakfast, the family explored the village. There was a market in the square where the locals sold handmade crafts and sweets wrapped in parchment paper. Yet, despite the cheerful scene, the villagers spoke in hushed tones and cast furtive glances at the Wainwrights. "Why are they staring?" Chloe whispered. "They're not used to tourists, that's all," Peter reassured her. But there was something else, something that prickled the back of Emma's neck. The villagers' eyes weren't just curious, they seemed worried. That evening, a dense fog rolled in, blanketing the manor grounds in an impenetrable gray. The world outside the windows felt distant, almost like a faded memory. The fireplace crackled, its warmth fighting against the damp chill that seemed to seep in from the walls. Mrs. Byrne arrived at their door just before nightfall, her expression tense. She carried a small bundle wrapped in faded linen. "Tonight is the longest night of the year," she said softly. "In Kilmora, we call it the Fell Night. We honor it by keeping the old ways." She unwrapped the bundle, revealing 4 sprigs of holly, each bound with a black ribbon. "What are these for?" Peter asked, exchanging a glance with Emma. "Protection," Mrs. Byrne replied. "Place one above each window and door, and—" She hesitated, her eyes lingering on the children. "No matter what you hear tonight, don't go outside and don't open the door for anyone. The fog brings visitors." "Visitors?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Byrne's face paled. "The lost ones. Those who wandered into the fog and never returned." She handed them the holly and left quickly, disappearing into the mist like a shadow. The family did as instructed. Peter placed the holly above the windows, and Emma hung one above the front door. Chloe and Jack watched silently, their eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Dinner was a quiet affair. The thick fog pressed against the windows, giving the impression that the house was floating in a sea of gray nothingness. After they finished eating, they settled in the living room, the fire's glow the only thing holding back the encroaching dark. Then they heard it. A faint thud against the window, like a soft hand pressing against the glass. Thud. Thud? "Just the wind," Peter muttered, though his voice was shaky. Chloe leaned closer to her mother. "It sounds like someone's out there." Emma swallowed hard, brushing a strand of hair from Chloe's face. "Remember what Mrs. Byrne said. We just need to stay inside." The thudding stopped. For a long, tense moment, there was silence. Then came a new sound, a faint scraping along the wall outside like fingernails dragging over stone. Jack whimpered. "I don't like this." Emma pulled him into her lap, forcing a smile. "It's okay, sweetie, it'll pass." But the scraping continued, moving from the wall to the windows. The sound circled the house, slow and deliberate, as though something was searching for a way in. Then they heard a whisper. Faint, just beyond the glass. "Let us in." The voice was thin and cold, like air escaping a tomb. Chloe's eyes welled with tears. "Mommy, I'm scared." Emma held her tighter. "Don't listen, honey. Just stay close." The whisper grew louder, joined by others. "It's cold out here. We're lost. Let us in." Peter clenched his fists, his knuckles white. We need to hold out until morning." Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The silence was worse. For a moment, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the sound of their own breaths. Then, from the hallway, they heard the faint creak of a floorboard. Inside the house. Peter shot to his feet. "Stay here," he hissed. "No!" Emma grabbed his arm. "Don't leave us." The sound grew closer. Slow, shuffling steps moving toward the living room. The air turned frigid and the fire sputtered, barely clinging to life. A shadow stretched across the hallway floor just beyond the doorway. Too tall, too thin. And then they saw it. A long, skeletal hand, pale as frost, curling around the doorframe. Chloe screamed. Peter lunged forward, grabbing the fireplace poker and slamming the hallway door shut just as the figure stepped into view. He jammed the poker through the door handles, barricading it. The whispers rose in a furious chorus, fists pounding against the wood. "Let us in! Let us in!" The holly above the door trembled, its black ribbon unraveling. Emma grabbed another sprig from the bundle, her hands shaking, and held it against the door. The pounding stopped. The whispers faded into the fog, and then silence. They stayed huddled together on the floor until the first light of dawn seeped through the windows, thin and pale. When Peter finally opened the door, there was nothing outside but the dissipating fog and a trail of wet footprints leading away from the house. Mrs. Byrne arrived later that morning, her eyes full of quiet understanding. "You kept the holly up," she said, glancing at the windows. Peter nodded. "What would have happened if we hadn't?" Mrs. Byrne's face was grim. The fog is always searching for new souls. If you let it in, you never leave. They left Kilmora that afternoon, the fog rolling in behind them as they drove away, like a curtain falling on a nightmare. But every Christmas Eve, when the night grew cold and fog crept across the ground, Chloe swore she could still hear the faint thud of hands against glass, asking to be let in. Thank you for watching Whispers of the Moon. If these stories gave you chills this holiday season, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe for more eerie tales, and hit that bell to never miss a haunting. Share your own scary Christmas experiences in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Until next time, stay warm, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the darkest stories hide behind the brightest lights.